She was still trembling when he found her behind the church, her back pressed to the sun-bleached timber, her fingers wrapped so tightly around the folded letter that the paper had begun to tear at the edges. The ink was smeared from where she had been crying, and the words that remained legible were enough to destroy everything she had spent 3 years quietly, carefully building in the town of Caldwell Creek, Kansas, in the summer of 1882. Harlan Langston had not meant to follow her out of the Sunday service. He had only noticed the way her shoulders went rigid the moment the Reverend called her name from the pulpit, the way her chin dropped just slightly before she schooled her expression back into that practiced stillness she wore like armor. He had noticed the letter tucked into her sleeve. He had noticed the color drain from her face before any other soul in the congregation had even looked up from their hymnals. He had noticed, and that was the problem, because no one was supposed to notice Elsie Talmadge. That was precisely how she had survived this long. She spun around when she heard his boot heels on the dry earth, and the ferocity in her eyes was something between a cornered animal and a woman ready to fight every secret back into the dark where she had buried them. "Do not," she said, and her voice was low and raw and absolutely certain. Harlan stopped 3 feet from her. He took off his hat and held it at his side, and he did not look away from her face. He had the kind of face that frontier life carved down to its essentials: sharp jaw, dark eyes that read everything slowly and said very little, a scar above his left brow that he had never once explained to anyone. He was 31 years old and he had been watching Elsie Talmadge for 6 months. "I am not going to tell anyone," he said. The fury in her eyes cracked just enough for fear to show through the gap. "You do not know what you think you know. I know that letter is from your husband," he said. "The one the whole town believes is dead." The silence that fell between them was enormous, wide and dangerous as an open canyon with no visible floor. A mockingbird called twice from the cottonwood tree at the edge of the churchyard and then went quiet, as if even the birds understood something irreversible was happening in the dry August heat. Elsie's hand loosened. The letter fell into the dust at her feet. She looked at it and did not pick it up. "How long have you known?" she whispered. Harlan crouched down and picked up the letter himself, folding it carefully along its existing creases and holding it out to her. She did not take it immediately. She was studying him with the particular intensity of someone calculating how fast they could run and whether it would make any difference. "I have not had anyone notice that about me before," she whispered, meaning the truth of her, the hidden architecture of her life that she had constructed so precisely that everyone else in Caldwell Creek saw only the widow schoolteacher with the neat bun and the quiet manner, and the habit of walking home alone. She meant the fact that she was not a widow at all. She meant the dark past she had fled 1,200 miles to escape. She meant that for 3 years she had believed herself invisible, and one man had simply looked and seen all of it. "I have not had anyone notice that about me before." Harlan held her gaze, and his voice was steady and certain in a way that frightened her more than anger would have. "I have noticed everything," he said. 6 months earlier, on a cold February morning when the prairie wind was vicious enough to push a grown man sideways, Elsie Talmadge had stepped off the Kansas Pacific Railroad at Caldwell Creek carrying a single leather traveling bag, a trunk that the station agent let her leave in his office for 3 days while she found lodging, and a name that was not entirely her own. Her real name was Elsie Hargrove. She had been born in Louisville, Kentucky, in 1856, the second daughter of a tobacco merchant who believed that a woman's most important quality was her willingness to be managed. She had believed him too, right up until the morning she stopped believing anything at all about the life she had been handed. She had married Calhoun Talmadge in the spring of 1878. He was handsome in the way that certain dangerous things are handsome, all clean lines and bright surfaces with nothing sound underneath. He was charming at dinner parties and he was brutal in private, and like many men of his particular variety, he was also extraordinarily good at appearing to be wronged whenever anyone examined his behavior too closely. He had powerful friends. He had a politician's instinct for making accusation read like fact and fact read like slander. When Elsie finally ran, in the winter of 1879, she had left with $43, a change of clothes, and a plan so fragile she had not let herself think about it too hard because she knew that thinking about it would show her every place it could fail. She kept Talmadge as her surname because it was all she had that was documentable. She claimed to be a widow because widows were sympathetic and unthreatening, and did not invite the kind of questions that a woman traveling alone and lying about her husband's whereabouts would otherwise attract. She had genuine teaching credentials from the Louisville Female College, and those she had not needed to fabricate at all. Caldwell Creek needed a schoolteacher badly enough that they had not looked too carefully at anything else. For 3 years she had been careful. She had been so extraordinarily, exhaustingly careful that some nights she lay awake and felt the carefulness like a physical weight pressing down on her chest, a corset made of secrets that she could never remove even when she was alone. She had not made close friends. She had not permitted herself to feel anything she could not control. She had smiled at the right moments and declined invitations that might lead to the kind of intimacy where questions got asked. And she had been, by all accounts, a perfectly pleasant and entirely unknowable woman. And then Harlan Langston arrived in Caldwell Creek in August of 1881, and everything she had so carefully constructed began to feel, for the first time, insufficient. He came to town with a reputation that preceded him by about 3 days, carried on the tongues of 2 cattle drovers who had met him on the Kishom Trail, and could not decide whether they admired or feared him. He had been a lawman once in Texas, before something happened that nobody seemed to know the full truth of. He had then spent several years working as a range detective for one of the large cattle operations out of Abilene, tracking stolen livestock and the men who stole it across several hundred miles of territory, where the law was a concept rather than a practice. He had come to Caldwell Creek because he had bought 40 acres of land on the creek's eastern bank, with money he had saved and invested with a care that surprised people who expected men of his occupation to be reckless with everything, and he intended to run cattle on it. He was quiet in the way that genuinely self-contained people are quiet, not withdrawn or cold, but simply not in need of the constant social affirmation that other men seem to require. He came to the general store when he needed provisions. He attended church because he believed in it, not because it was useful to be seen there. He was polite to everyone and familiar with no one, except that he watched. Elsie noticed him noticing her approximately 2 weeks after his arrival, when she was buying ink and paper at Callaway's general store, and he came in for tobacco and salt. He glanced at her once, the way strangers in a small town acknowledge each other, and then he looked away. But then he looked back, and there was something in the second look that was different from the first, something that had the quality of recognition rather than simple politeness. She told herself she was imagining it. She was not imagining it. What Harlan had noticed in those first weeks was not what she expected. He had not noticed the falseness of her widow's story, not yet. What he had noticed first was smaller and more devastating than that. He had noticed the way she held her left hand slightly behind her body when she walked, as if concealing it, and when he had contrived an opportunity to see it clearly, he had observed the old break in the third finger that had healed at a wrong angle. He had noticed that she flinched at sudden sounds, not with the startled response of a nervous woman, but with the precise, controlled micro-flinch of someone who had spent years training themselves not to react visibly. He had noticed that she always sat with her back to a wall in the church pew. He had noticed that she scanned the room when she entered any building, not casually, but with the methodical sweep of someone who needed to know all the exits. He was a man who had spent years reading people for his survival and theirs, and what he read in Elsie Talmadge was a woman running from something specific and serious, a woman who had learned to be afraid with exceptional professionalism. He did not tell anyone. He was not the sort of man who dealt in other people's danger as currency. He simply went on watching, and he felt something that he recognized, with considerable reluctance, as the beginning of something he had not permitted himself in a very long time. The months between his arrival and that August morning behind the church were not empty. They were filled with the slow and intricate grammar of two people who are deeply aware of each other and attempting, with unequal success, to pretend otherwise. He had helped her carry books to the schoolhouse one April morning when she was struggling with a particularly large box, and the mud from 3 days of rain had made the main street treacherous. He had simply appeared beside her, taken the box without asking, and carried it the quarter-mile to the schoolhouse and set it on the front step. She had thanked him with the particular formal precision she applied to all potentially intimate interactions, and he had tipped his hat and walked away, and neither of them had looked back, though she had listened to his footsteps all the way down the road. In May he had come to the school fundraiser and sat in the back of the church hall and listened to her read aloud from a collection of poetry she had chosen for the occasion, Longfellow and Whitman, and one small piece by Emily Dickinson that she had found in a magazine, and that had struck her as so precisely right about something she could not name that her voice had gone slightly soft in the middle of it. Afterward, the other women in town had complimented her reading in the general, cheerful way of people who had enjoyed themselves. Harlan had waited until nearly everyone was gone and said simply that the Dickinson piece was the best choice she had made, because it had the quality of something true rather than something performed. She had stood very still and looked at him, and then said thank you, and then gone home and sat in her kitchen for 20 minutes feeling something she firmly classified as unsettled. In June, there had been a storm, the kind that came up from the south with almost no warning and turned the sky a sickening yellow-green and made the cattle low and pace. Elsie had been walking home from the school when it hit, and the rain had arrived with a violence that soaked through her clothing in approximately 90 seconds. She had taken shelter in the doorway of the feed barn at the edge of town, and Harlan had been there already, having ridden in from his property when the clouds changed. They had stood 3 feet apart in the feed barn doorway for 40 minutes while the storm tore across the prairie, and they had talked. This was the extraordinary thing. They had simply talked. He had asked her about the East, careful about it, not prying for specifics but genuinely curious about the world she had come from, and she had found herself answering in ways that were both true and safe, talking about what it felt like to grow up in a city where everything was crowded and dense compared to this enormous sky, talking about the smell of river water and horse traffic, and the particular quality of summer heat, in a place where the trees were tall enough to create actual shade. He had listened in a way she had almost never encountered, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually absorbing what she said, turning it over, responding to what she had meant rather than just what she had said. She had told him she found the prairie lonely sometimes, and that it also felt like freedom in a way she had not expected and could not fully explain. He had said he understood that contradiction completely. When the storm passed and the sky went quiet and clean, they had walked out into the washed evening air, and she had gone one direction and he had gone another, and she had walked all the way home telling herself that she could not afford what was happening to her, that safety required distance, that the only trap more dangerous than the one she had escaped was a new one built from trust. She told herself this repeatedly and with total conviction, and it did not help at all. July brought the 4th of July celebration that the town threw every year on the square, with a brass band that arrived on the train from Wichita, and a display of fireworks that the mayor considered an expression of civic pride. The whole population of Caldwell Creek and a good portion of the surrounding ranching community gathered in the square, and there was food and music, and the particular festive energy of a frontier community that had made it another year. Elsie had gone because not going would have drawn notice, and drawing notice was the thing she most carefully avoided. She wore her good dress, the dark blue one with the ivory collar that she had bought the previous autumn, and that the dressmaker had told her made her eyes look remarkable, a comment she had deflected so quickly that the dressmaker had looked slightly hurt. She had been standing at the edge of the square watching a group of children chase each other around the base of the flagpole when Harlan appeared at her left side, 2 cups of lemonade in hand, and offered her one with absolutely no ceremony, as if they were people who simply always shared lemonade at summer celebrations and always had. She took it because refusing would have required an explanation she did not have. They stood together watching the children and the dancing and the brass band working through a rousing version of something patriotic, and Harlan said, without looking at her, that he had noticed she never danced at these things. She said she did not know any of the local dances well enough to attempt them without embarrassing herself. He said he found that very hard to believe, because he had seen her move through a room, and she had the kind of physical awareness that people who dance well never fully lose. She had turned and looked at him then, because that was the kind of observation that required a direct response, and he was looking back at her with that quality of total attention that she had come to understand was simply how he engaged with things that mattered to him. The fireworks began behind her, great cascading bursts of red and gold that lit the whole square in shifting color, and she said, very quietly, that she had not had anyone notice that about her before, meaning not the dancing but the entirety of what he saw when he looked at her, the truth beneath the surface she worked so hard to maintain. He had said nothing to that. He had simply held her gaze a moment longer, and then looked out at the fireworks, and handed her his empty cup when he was finished, and said good evening and walked away into the crowd. She had stood there holding both cups and feeling, for the first time in 3 years, entirely visible. And now it was August, and her husband was not dead, and Harlan Langston knew it, and Elsie Talmadge was standing behind the church with her careful, constructed life dissolving around her like the edges of wet paper. She took the letter from his hand. "He found me," she said. It was not a question. It was the thing she had been afraid of every morning she woke up in this town, the fear that had outlasted the physical distance and the changed name and the years of practiced invisibility. "What does he want?" Harlan asked. She laughed, a short, hard sound with nothing of humor in it. "He wants me back. He always wants me back, not because he loves me, because I belong to him in his understanding of the world, because I left and leaving is the one thing he cannot tolerate." Harlan was quiet a moment. "Is he coming here?" She opened the letter and read the relevant line. Her hand was steadier than she expected. "He says he will be in Caldwell Creek within the fortnight. He says he has informed the town marshal that his wife, who is suffering from a mental affliction that caused her to flee her home, has been located and will be returned for medical treatment." The cruelty of it was so precisely constructed that she almost admired it, in the way you could briefly admire the engineering of a trap even as it closed around you. Mental affliction. A neat cage of language that made her escape into her crime and her crime into her illness. "He has friends in high places," she said. "A senator, a federal judge. Men who take his word over mine because his word comes from a man, and mine comes from a woman who has already demonstrated by running that she cannot be trusted." Harlan sat down on a low section of fence that bordered the churchyard and looked at the dry Kansas sky for a moment. He was thinking. She could see it. Not the agitated thinking of a man flailing toward panic, but the slow, methodical kind that moved through problems in a specific order. "Does anyone in this town know the truth?" he asked. "No one," she said, "except you." He looked at her. "You have been carrying this alone for 3 years. "Yes." "And you have been good at it," he said, and there was no irony in his voice, only what sounded remarkably like respect. "Extraordinarily good at it, but you cannot fight this alone, not with the resources he has." "I am aware of that," she said. "I have been aware of it the entire time. There is no winning this. There is only running again." Something shifted in his face. "Where would you go?" She shook her head. Her eyes were dry. She had used up her tears in the first year, and now when things were at their worst she went very still and very clear, like water going cold. "I do not know. West. Colorado maybe. Oregon. Somewhere far enough that it buys me time." Harlan was quiet for a long moment. The morning light had gotten fully established now, gold and flat over the Kansas plain, and the church behind them was beginning to let out its Sunday congregation, voices and footsteps moving in the middle distance. "There is another option," he said. She waited. "If you were actually a widow," he said, "he would have no claim on you." The silence that followed had a different quality than the previous one. She was processing what he had said with all the careful machinery of a mind that had learned to identify traps. "He is not dead," she said slowly. "No," Harlan agreed, "but you could be legally protected in other ways. If you were married to someone else, a man who was prepared to stand between you and what is coming, a man who had some familiarity with how these situations are managed and some resources of his own." She stared at him. "You are not proposing what I think you are proposing." "I am proposing exactly what you think I am," he said, and his voice was so even and matter-of-fact that it was more affecting than any passionate declaration would have been. "I am not suggesting it as a romantic gesture. I am telling you it is a practical solution to an immediate threat. If you are my wife, Harlan Talmadge cannot touch you without going through me, and I have certain connections in the territorial law enforcement community that complicate his position considerably." "That is bigamy," she said. "I am already married." "You are married to a man who broke your finger," he said very quietly. She said nothing. "And very likely more than that," he said, still nothing. "I spent 3 years working as a range detective," he said. "I know people in this territory, marshals, judges, men who owe me and men I can bargain with. More importantly, I know a lawyer in Wichita who specializes in exactly this kind of domestic legal entanglement, and who has successfully argued for the dissolution of several marriages in Kansas on grounds of cruelty, desertion, and coercion. Kansas law is not the most favorable in the country for this purpose, but it is not hopeless. What is hopeless is fighting Harlan Talmadge's lawyers and political connections alone and without resources." Elsie turned away from him and looked at the horizon, which was flat and immense, and offered no answers but also no walls. She thought about running. She thought about another railroad ticket and another strange town and another constructed name and another 10 years of perfect, exhausting, lonely caution. She thought about the way he had listened to her talk about the smell of river water, and the way he had identified the Dickinson poem as something true rather than performed, and the way he had seen the break in her finger and said nothing for months, and never once used it as leverage. She thought about the fact that she was 26 years old, and she had never once been genuinely seen by anyone who did not then proceed to use what they saw against her. She turned back around. "You would do this," she said. "Not as a romantic gesture. I did not say it would not become something else," he said carefully. "I said I am not offering it as one currently. I am offering it as protection. What comes after is up to both of us and has no deadline." She looked at him for a long time. He did not look away. He did not shift or fidget or modify his expression to be more persuasive. He simply waited with the patient certainty of a man who knew the value of giving a frightened person enough space to make a real choice. "I need to think," she said. "All right," he said. "Not here," she said. "Tonight, I will give you an answer tonight." "All right," he said again, and put his hat back on, and walked around the corner of the church and back into the ordinary morning, as if the conversation they had just had were a thing that happened every day and left no particular mark on the air. She stood there another 5 minutes before she was steady enough to follow. The schoolhouse was empty on Sundays, and she had a key to it. She went there after the church crowd had dispersed, let herself in, and sat at the desk at the front of the room where she normally stood to teach, which gave her a view of the small chalkboard where someone had written, in the childish hand of the last student left to clean up on Friday, a list of the states of the Union in alphabetical order. She read them all twice without really seeing them. She thought about what she knew of Harlan Langston, which was simultaneously very little and quite a great deal. She knew almost nothing factual about him beyond what was locally known. She knew the quality of his attention, which was the most honest thing about a person and the hardest to fake. She knew that he had had 6 months in which to use what he suspected about her, and had chosen, every single time, not to. She knew that he had offered help in the form that was most needed rather than the form that was most comfortable to himself. She thought about the letter in her pocket and what would happen in 14 days if she did nothing. She thought about what running had cost her the first time, the terror of it, the grief of leaving behind the few things she had loved, the long, cold process of building a life from scratch in a place that did not know her name. She thought about doing it again. And then she thought about not doing it again. She found Harlan at his property that evening, the 40 acres east of the creek, where he was in the process of building a proper house to replace the temporary shelter he had been using since the autumn. The house was half built, the frame up and the roof on the front section, but the walls still open to the air on the east side, and he was working by lantern light on something at the far end, measuring lumber with a methodical care that was characteristic of everything she had observed him do. He heard her coming and straightened up and turned, and he did not look surprised, which meant he had expected her one way or the other. She stood at the edge of the lantern light and said, "I have 3 conditions." He set down his measuring tape. "Tell me, first, if this arrangement ever becomes something genuine, I need to come to that genuinely without feeling as though I owe it to you. I cannot begin something from obligation. I tried that once and we know how it ended." "Agreed," he said. "Second, I want to be involved in every decision made regarding the legal situation. I am not a problem to be solved on my behalf. I am a person who needs to be part of the solving." "That was never in question," he said, and his tone suggested that the idea of doing otherwise had genuinely not occurred to him. "Third," she said, and her voice went slightly quieter, "if this does not work, if Calhoun has enough power to override everything we try, I want your word that you will help me run, not stay and be noble about it. Help me actually get out." He was quiet a moment. "I give you my word on all 3, she nodded. "Then yes." The word hung in the warm evening air and did not feel as terrifying as she had expected. It felt unexpectedly like the first solid thing she had stood on in 3 years. "We will need to act quickly," he said. 14 days is not much time. I need to send a telegram to the lawyer in Wichita first thing tomorrow morning." "I know," she said. He looked at her for a moment in the lantern light and then said, with a simplicity that she felt somewhere in the bones of her chest, "You are very brave. I want you to know that I see that." She had not been told she was brave in a very long time, and certainly not by someone whose judgment she trusted. She felt the words land and settle, and she did not deflect them or minimize them. She simply stood still and let herself have them. "Thank you," she said. She walked back to her rented room in town, and for the first time in years she slept without waking at every sound. The wedding, such as it was, happened on a Tuesday morning at the office of the Caldwell Creek Justice of the Peace. One Bennett Farrow, a former schoolteacher himself who had served in this administrative capacity for 11 years, and who was known for his discretion and his complete indifference to drama. Harlan had explained only that the matter was urgent, and Farrow, who had seen enough of frontier life to understand that urgency frequently carried its own perfectly sufficient explanation, had asked no unnecessary questions. There were 2 witnesses: Harlan's neighbor, an older rancher named Chester Holt who had known Harlan since his law enforcement days and asked nothing at all, and Millie Graves, who ran the millinery shop and who was the closest thing Elsie had to a friend in Caldwell Creek, and who agreed to be present after Elsie told her a carefully edited version of the truth that included the essential danger without the full legal complexity. Millie had gripped her hand tightly before the ceremony and said, "He is a good man, Elsie. Whatever the circumstances are, that matters." Elsie had found, to her considerable surprise, that she agreed. The ceremony was 12 minutes long. When Farrow pronounced them legally wed under the laws of the state of Kansas, Harlan put a plain gold band on Elsie's finger, bought from the jeweler the previous day, and she felt the weight of it with a complicated mixture of emotions that she did not attempt to sort out on the spot. Harlan shook Pharaoh's hand and then looked at Elsie, and she looked at him, and something passed between them that was acknowledgement and gratitude and something else, something quieter and more fundamental that neither of them named yet because the moment was too precarious, and there was too much else to attend to. The telegram to the Wichita lawyer, a man named Ambrose Sheehan, who Harlan had used twice before in legal matters related to his detective work, went out Monday morning, and the response came Wednesday afternoon. Sheehan confirmed that he could make the trip, and that the situation, as Harlan had described it, had legal avenues worth pursuing, specifically grounds for desertion on Talmadge's part during the period when Elsie had left, and potentially annulment on the basis of fraudulent representation at the time of the original marriage. A complex argument, but not an impossible one. He arrived Friday on the noon train, a wiry man in his late 40s with ink-stained fingers and the specific sharp-eyed focus of someone who spent their professional life finding the precise crack in an apparently solid wall. He met with both Elsie and Harlan together, at Harlan's insistence, because Harlan had told her the second condition was not negotiable and he meant it. Elsie told Sheehan everything, the full truth, without editing, for the first time in 3 years. She told him about Louisville and the marriage and the beatings and the broken finger and the other injuries she had not named to anyone. And she told him about the senator and the federal judge and the specific threats Calhoun had made on the occasion. She had previously tried to seek help from a local sheriff, who had turned out to be entirely in Calhoun's pocket. She told him about running and about the money and about the 3 years in Caldwell Creek. Sheehan listened with total professional attention and made notes in a small book with a mechanical regularity that was somehow deeply reassuring, as if the act of writing it down was itself a form of making it real and manageable. When she finished, he looked at his notes and said, "The remarriage complicates the bigamy question, but it also strengthens the argument for immediate protective relief, because the Kansas courts will be reluctant to dissolve a local marriage without strong cause, and your husband's approach, the mental illness framing, is actually vulnerable on several points if we can establish documented evidence of the physical mistreatment." "The finger," Harlan said. "The finger is a start," Sheehan said, "but a doctor's examination and testimony would be more powerful. Do you have anything written? Letters, diaries, anything contemporaneous?" Elsie had a small journal she had kept during the worst years, locked in the bottom of her trunk, that she had never shown to anyone alive. She told Sheehan it existed. He said it might be the most important document in the case. She went home that evening and retrieved the journal from the bottom of the trunk and sat at her kitchen table for a long time before she opened it. The handwriting inside was smaller and more controlled than her current script, the handwriting of someone who had learned to make themselves small in every possible dimension. Reading it was like meeting a younger version of herself through glass. She brought it to Sheehan the next morning. He read 20 pages and set it on the table and said, in a tone that had shed some of its professional distance, "We have a case. It will not be easy and it will depend significantly on the specific judge assigned, but we have a genuine case." Calhoun Talmadge arrived in Caldwell Creek on a Thursday, 9 days after the letter, 1 day ahead of his own projected schedule, which Elsie suspected was intentional. He was exactly as she remembered him, which was somehow worse than if time had changed him. He was 40 years old and he looked younger, the way men of his particular kind often managed to look younger than they were, as if the energy they fed from others sustained them. He was handsome in his expensive clothes, and he carried himself with the ease of a man who had never in his adult life been in a room where the power did not belong to him. He came to the school. She saw him from the schoolhouse window during the lunch hour, walking up the main street with the town marshal, whose name was Garrett Willis, at his side. Willis was not a corrupt man exactly, but he was a cautious one who deferred to authority, and Harlan Talmadge arrived with a letter from a federal official that read as authority. Harlan was there before Calhoun reached the school door. She did not know precisely how he had known, except that she had come to understand that Harlan's particular skill was exactly this, an awareness of when and where things were going to converge. He was standing on the step when Calhoun and Willis arrived, and he looked at Calhoun with an expression that was not threatening exactly and was not friendly at all, the specific controlled neutrality of someone who has decided how this will go and is simply waiting for the other party to arrive at the same understanding. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he said. Willis said they were looking for Elsie Hargrove, also known as Elsie Talmadge. "My wife," Harlan said. "She is teaching." "Is there something I can help you with?" The silence that followed was one of those silences that rearranges the air. Calhoun's face went very still, which Elsie knew from long experience was how he looked when he was calculating. "Your wife," Calhoun said, with a smile that did not reach his eyes at any point. "I see. And when did this marriage take place?" "Tuesday," Harlan said. "Would you like to see the certificate? I have it here." He reached into his coat and produced the document, which he had been carrying for exactly this eventuality. He handed it to Willis, who read it with the careful attention of a man who knew he was in a situation with competing claims and did not want to make an error. Calhoun said, with controlled fury dressed as patience, "That marriage is bigamous. She is my legal wife under the laws of Kentucky." "She may well have been," Sheehan said, stepping around the corner of the building because he had also been expecting this and had positioned himself accordingly. "But the state of Kansas has significant jurisdiction concerns here, and my client, Mrs. Langston, has filed the relevant paperwork this morning for the dissolution of the prior marriage on grounds of documented physical cruelty, which is recognized as sufficient cause under applicable Kansas statute. She has also provided testimony and documentary evidence to the Sedgwick County District Court, which is where this matter will now be adjudicated." He handed Willis a second document, this one bearing an official stamp. Willis looked from one document to the other with the expression of a man who had expected to spend Thursday enforcing something simple and was now in the middle of a legal situation that required expertise he did not have. Calhoun's smile had gone away entirely. His voice dropped to a register that Elsie, from inside the schoolroom where she had moved her students to the far wall and was standing with them, could not hear, but she watched through the window and she could read the particular set of his jaw that meant he was making a threat. Harlan listened to whatever was said, and then said something back, quietly, and then said something else, and Willis nodded twice and stepped back. Calhoun's posture remained rigid for another 10 seconds, and then something in it shifted. Not defeat. He would not reach defeat for some time yet, but the recalculation of a man who had met a form of resistance he had not anticipated and needed to revise his approach. He left. Willis stayed long enough to speak to Harlan briefly, and then he left as well. Elsie sent the children out for the remainder of the lunch hour and came out of the schoolhouse and stood on the step and looked at Harlan, who was folding the marriage certificate back into his coat. "He will try again," she said. "Yes," Harlan agreed. "But now it is a legal fight rather than a personal one, and that changes everything about the terrain. He has powerful men on his side." "So do we," Harlan said. "Sheehan knows the Sedgwick County District Judge personally, and I have a contact in the U.S. Marshal's office in Wichita who has been looking for a reason to look more carefully at the association between your husband and the federal judge he claims as an ally. It turns out that particular judge has other problems that have nothing to do with you." She stood on the step and looked at him standing below her in the morning light, and she thought about what it meant that he had done all of this, had built all of these arrangements, not as a trap or as a trade, but simply because a problem existed and he was the person best positioned to address it. "Why?" she said. He looked up at her. "Why what? Why are you doing all of this? The real answer, not the practical one." He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "Because I have been watching you be extraordinarily capable and entirely alone for 6 months, and I found that I could not continue to do that." She looked at him for a long time. A September wind moved through the street, carrying the first faint promise of the autumn that was approaching. "Come to dinner tonight," she said. "I will cook." Something in his face changed, so briefly she might have missed it if she had not been watching him with the same attention he paid to her. "All right," he said. She cooked a genuine meal that evening for the first time in months, because she had been in the habit of eating simply and without effort since cooking for one person felt like too much ceremony for too small an occasion. She made a beef stew with the root vegetables from the general store and cornbread in the Dutch oven, and she set the table with the 2 proper plates she owned, and the good cloth napkins she had not taken out since she arrived in Caldwell Creek. When he knocked at 7 o'clock, she was struck, absurdly, by a sudden attack of something that felt remarkably like nervousness, which was ridiculous given the fact that they were legally married and had already weathered a confrontation with her husband of record that same morning. She let him in and he took off his hat and looked at the table and said it looked very fine. They ate and they talked, and what was remarkable about it was how unremarkable it was, not in a disappointing way, but in the way that the most genuinely comfortable things are unremarkable because they require no performance. She told him things she had not told anyone, not the dark history. She had already laid that out for Sheehan, and revisiting it was not what the evening called for, but the smaller truths, that she had once wanted to study medicine, that she had a genuine gift for mathematics that the Louisville Female College had treated as a curiosity rather than a vocation, that her favorite thing about Kansas was the way the prairie grass moved in the wind, which looked like water and felt like something that had been going on long before human beings arrived to witness it. He told her that he had left the law enforcement work in Texas because a man had died who should not have died, because Harlan had made a decision under pressure that had felt correct at the time and had turned out to be wrong, and he had not been able to make his peace with the institution after that. Not because the institution was corrupt, but because he needed to be able to make his own decisions about right and wrong without a badge that sometimes constrained the distinction. She said she thought that was the most honest thing she had ever heard a former lawman say. He said he thought the most honest thing he had ever heard her say was when she told him, at the summer celebration, that the prairie felt like freedom and also like loneliness, because that was a true thing about a certain kind of life that most people refused to say aloud. She refilled his coffee cup and he thanked her, and she sat down across from him again, and she looked at him, her husband of 4 days, this man she had known for 6 months and understood in the deep particular way that she understood almost no one, and she thought that she was very possibly in the process of falling in love with him, and that this was either the most logical thing that had ever happened to her or the most dangerous. And that for perhaps the first time in her adult life, the logical thing and the dangerous thing were pointing in the same direction, and she was inclined to follow them. She did not say any of this. She said that she hoped the Sedgwick County judge proved reliable. He said he did too, and finished his coffee, and said good night and left, and she sat at the table after he was gone and felt the particular warmth of an evening that had gone entirely right. The legal proceedings took 11 weeks, which was both shorter than she had expected and longer than she could comfortably sustain. There were 2 trips to Wichita, one for filing and one for the hearing, and on both occasions Harlan traveled with her, because Sheehan had advised that the appearance of a settled, supported domestic situation was not nothing in the eyes of a frontier court. Calhoun hired a Kansas lawyer and contested everything with the resources of someone for whom money was not a constraint. There were depositions and counter-filings, and 2 postponements that Sheehan handled with the contained fury of someone who knows every delay is strategic. The doctor in Caldwell Creek, a man named Nathaniel Cross who had arrived from Ohio the previous year, and who Elsie had found to be a person of genuine moral seriousness, examined her hand, and produced a written statement about the old break that was precise and damning. The journal provided the contemporaneous record of events that Sheehan had identified as essential. A former housemaid in Louisville, a woman named Clara Marsh, who Sheehan's investigative contact had located and who had witnessed specific incidents, provided a written affidavit that cost her considerable courage and that Elsie would feel grateful for the rest of her life. The hearing itself lasted 2 days. Elsie sat in the Sedgwick County courtroom and answered every question she was asked with the complete and clear truthfulness of someone who had been hiding for 3 years and was finished with it. When Calhoun's attorney attempted to press the mental instability argument, Sheehan produced the journal and the housemaid's affidavit and the doctor's report and said, in a tone of absolute judicial reasonableness, that he was prepared to argue that the instability in this marriage had originated with the other party. The judge, whose name was Elias Drummond and who had the specific weary competence of a man who had heard a great many things in his courtroom and was not easily manipulated by the powerful, retired to consider his ruling on the afternoon of the second day. He returned the following morning. He dissolved the marriage. He cited documented cruelty, the historical and continuing nature of it, and the coercive misrepresentation of the original terms of the union. He noted that the matter of the subsequent remarriage was a complexity that the Kansas courts were prepared to resolve in favor of the local documented marriage on jurisdictional grounds. He delivered this ruling in the even, considered voice of a man who has made a decision he is confident in, and when he was done, there was a long moment of absolute silence in the courtroom. Elsie sat very still and heard the words arrive one by one, and then she put her hand over her mouth and closed her eyes for a moment, not from grief, but from the sheer physical magnitude of relief, which she had not felt in so long she had forgotten what it felt like in the body. It felt like putting down something very heavy. She opened her eyes and looked at Harlan beside her, and he was already looking at her with that complete, unhurried attention, and she saw in his face the same relief, and also something else, the something that had been growing in the space between them for months and now had room to exist without the constant pressure of crisis compressing it. She reached over and took his hand. He held it. Outside the Sedgwick County Courthouse they stood on the steps in the November sun, which was thin and cold but genuinely present, and Sheehan shook their hands and said he would be in touch about the final documentation, and then he walked down the steps to hail the approaching conveyance, and they were alone. "It is over," she said. "The legal part," he agreed. She laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere she had not accessed in a very long time, and the sound of it surprised her slightly, as if she were meeting a version of herself she had almost forgotten existed. Harlan Talmadge left Kansas that evening, on the westbound train. He did not speak to either of them before he left. Sheehan had learned, through his contacts, that the federal judge who had been Calhoun's most powerful ally was currently under investigation for improprieties unrelated to Elsie's case, but significant enough to have effectively neutralized his usefulness. Without that protection, and without the legal victory he had been so certain of, Calhoun retreated, because men of his type rarely stayed where they could not win, and he would find another way to express his need for dominance on some other person in some other place, and that was a thing she could not fix, but it was also no longer her problem to carry. She chose not to carry it. On the train back to Caldwell Creek, as the winter prairie moved past the window in shades of brown and gold, Harlan said, "We have been married 7 weeks, and I have not yet kissed my wife." She looked at him across the narrow train compartment and felt warmth move through her that was entirely different from any warmth she had let herself feel in years. "That seems like an oversight," she said. He leaned across and kissed her, and it was gentle and certain and unhurried, with none of the performance of grand gestures and all of the truth of something that has been building for a long time, and she kissed him back with the full presence of a woman who has decided, consciously and irrevocably, to be completely in it. When they arrived back in Caldwell Creek, everything was the same and nothing was the same. The winter that followed was the most genuine one she had ever spent. She continued to teach at the school, which she loved with a clarity she had previously not quite let herself acknowledge. And in the evenings she went home to the house on the eastern property, where Harlan had finished the second section of walls and added 2 proper rooms to the original frame, and they built a life together with the specific attention of people who understood what it cost to not have that. She learned that he was extraordinarily competent at practical things, the maintenance of property and animals and machinery, and that he was also, beneath the contained exterior, deeply fond of books, and that he read voraciously on winter nights and was capable of extended, engaged conversation about almost anything that had been written down. She learned that he did not require constant talk, that silence with him was the comfortable kind, the kind that 2 people build together rather than the silence imposed by one person on another. He learned that she had opinions about nearly everything, and that the contained, careful woman the rest of Caldwell Creek knew was only one facet of a person who was, when safe, intensely alive. He learned that she was funnier than she appeared, with a dry, precise wit that operated at a frequency that required attention to catch, and that she would not be managed in domestic matters any more than in legal ones, and that this was entirely to his preference. He learned that she woke from nightmares sometimes in the early months, the residue of years that do not simply dissolve because the legal framework changes, and that the most useful thing he could do was be present and awake and not make anything of it. She learned that he had his own version of this, quieter and less frequent, the night that a man died because of a choice he had made, and that being trusted with another person's dark hours was a privilege and not a burden. By February they had ceased to be married in name only in any sense of the phrase, and by March she had stopped waiting for the other shoe to fall, the long-trained reflex of a woman who had learned that good things were followed by the withdrawal of good things, and had begun simply living inside the good thing, because it was real and it was hers, and she had earned it in the most thorough possible way. She wrote to Clara Marsh, the former housemaid in Louisville whose affidavit had been so essential, a genuine letter of gratitude that was also an offer of character reference if Clara ever needed it and should find herself on the western side of the Mississippi. Clara wrote back, a warm, direct letter from a woman who had her own particular courage, and they maintained a correspondence that continued for years. Millie Graves, who had stood as her witness at the Tuesday morning ceremony, and who had asked no unnecessary questions then, asked considerably more of them now, with the cheerful intrusiveness of a genuine friend who had been patient long enough. Elsie found that answering them, or most of them, was not the ordeal she had anticipated, but rather something she had simply needed more time and safety to be capable of. Spring arrived in Caldwell Creek with its particular violence of color, the whole prairie going green almost overnight after the long brown winter, the creek running high with snowmelt from wherever the Rocky Mountains were sending their water eastward. Elsie stood on the porch of their house one April evening and watched the sun go down across 40 acres of their own land, and felt an ownership of the moment so complete that it was almost frightening. She did not let it be frightening. She let it be what it was. Harlan came out and stood beside her with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one, the same unremarkable domestic gesture that contained everything she valued most, and she leaned slightly against his shoulder and looked at the colors the sky was doing over the Kansas plain. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "When I arrived here 3 years ago I had a plan. It was a good plan as far as it went, but the thing I did not plan for was you." He was quiet, listening. "I had decided," she said, "that I was not going to let myself want anything I could lose. Because I knew from experience that wanting things meant they could be taken, and that the people who had the power to take things were often the people you had trusted most. So I decided to want nothing. And then you started noticing things about me, and I found that being seen by someone I could trust was worse than being invisible, because it made me want to stop hiding. And wanting to stop hiding was terrifying. Because what if I stopped hiding and the thing I had been hiding from arrived anyway? She stopped. But it did arrive, she said, and you were there, and it was survivable. He put his arm around her shoulders and she stayed where she was, leaning into the warmth of him. You were always going to survive, he said. That was never really in question for me. The question was whether you were going to have to keep surviving alone. She turned her face up to look at him. I am very glad that the answer turned out to be no. He kissed her forehead and then her temple, and then she turned properly toward him and kissed him the way that belonged to private evenings and 40 acres of their own ground and a future that was open in every direction. That summer, she discovered she was pregnant. She told Harlan on a Saturday morning in June while they were eating breakfast, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table with the window open to the warm air and the sound of the creek in the distance. And she said it plainly, without elaborate preparation, because she had learned that he preferred directness, and she had come to find it a relief herself. He set down his fork and looked at her, and his face did the thing it did when something genuinely moved him, which was not a grand display but a quality of stillness that was different from ordinary stillness, as if something inside had stopped to receive the information fully. Yes, he said. Yes, she said. He got up from his side of the table and came around to hers and crouched down beside her chair so that they were at eye level, and he took her hand and held it in both of his with a careful gentleness that was one of the things she loved most about him, the way his hands, which were large and calloused from ranching work, could be so extraordinarily careful. How do you feel? He said. Terrified, she said honestly, and happy, both at once. That seems correct, he said. I have no idea how to do this, she said. Neither do I, he said. We will figure it out. She laughed, and he smiled, and she thought that this was perhaps the most significant thing she could have known about him before everything else, that his response to the terrifying unknown was calm and practical and inclusive. We, not you, not I, but we. The baby was a boy. He arrived in February of 1884, which meant he had been conceived in the summer and carried through the autumn and born in the winter, and Elsie had an opinion about every stage of this that she was not shy about expressing. The pregnancy had not been easy. She had been exhausted in the first months in a bone-deep way that she had found alarming, until Dr. Cross had told her this was entirely within the normal range. The second trimester had been better. The third had been back to difficult, and the delivery itself had been long enough and hard enough that she had been intensely grateful for Dr. Cross's genuine competence and for Millie Graves, who had planted herself in the room with the specific immovable quality of a woman who has decided that she is needed and is entirely correct about it. Harlan had been in the front room of the house for 11 hours, which was what the conventions of the time prescribed, but which was very clearly at odds with his personal preferences. When Cross finally came out and said mother and son were healthy, the quality of Harlan's relief was something so complete and physical that Elsie heard it in his voice when he came in, even before she opened her eyes. She looked at the baby, who was small and loud and absolutely furious about the circumstances of his arrival, and she felt the most disorienting thing she had ever felt, which was a love so sudden and total that it seemed impossible that she had not known it was coming. They named him James, for no family member and no particular historical figure, simply because they both found it to be a good and solid name, and because naming him after someone they had left behind felt like bringing the past into something that was entirely about the future. James Langston grew into a serious, observant infant who had his father's eyes and his mother's instinct for watching a room before deciding what to do in it. Elsie returned to teaching in the autumn with James lodged at Millie's millinery during school hours, an arrangement Millie proposed herself with the enthusiasm of someone who considered children's company a distinct improvement over exclusively adult interaction. Life in Caldwell Creek in the years that followed took on the texture of something genuinely built. the specific density of days that accumulate into a life rather than simply into a history. Harlan's cattle operation on the 40 acres expanded gradually and sensibly. He added stock and hired one hand, a young man from the Cherokee Nation named Eli, whose family had been resettled in Indian Territory, and who had come north looking for ranch work, and who turned out to be one of the most capable stockmen Harlan had ever encountered. The two of them developed a working partnership, and then a genuine respect that crossed the various lines the world of 1884 spent considerable energy maintaining, and Elsie found this entirely characteristic of Harlan's particular way of operating in the world, which was to evaluate what a person actually was rather than what category the world had decided to place them in. The injustices of the territory were not invisible to her. She saw what had happened to the indigenous peoples of the Great Plains, the dispossession and the betrayal and the ongoing violence of policy dressed as civilization. And she saw what happened to women whose situations resembled hers, who did not have the specific combination of luck and resources, and a man with legal connections that she had had. And she did not let herself forget any of it in the comfortable warmth of her own safety. She started a small fund, with Millie's help and Dr. Cross's endorsement, that quietly assisted women in difficult domestic situations in Caldwell Creek and the surrounding area. It was not publicly identified as such, because openly naming it would have made it a target, but it was real and it functioned, and over the years it helped more people than she ever publicly counted. Harlan knew about it and supported it entirely and asked no questions he did not need to ask. In 1886, James was 2 years old and full of a furious energy that kept both his parents occupied and genuinely delighted, and Elsie discovered she was expecting again. This time the pregnancy went more smoothly, which she attributed partly to experience and partly to the fact that she was simply less afraid than she had been the first time. The second child was a girl. She arrived in the spring of 1887, and had from her very first hours a quality of expression that Elsie privately identified as determined, which was a thing she respected enormously. They named her Ruth, which was a name Elsie had always loved for its specific resonances of loyalty and chosen belonging, of someone who follows because they choose to rather than because they are required to. Ruth Langston grew up to be exactly as determined as her first hours suggested, which was both a source of profound parental pride and occasional profound parental exhaustion. James, 3 years older, treated her with the slightly bewildered affection of an older sibling who finds the younger one both incomprehensible and essential. They were good together, these two, with the specific complementary quality of siblings who have managed, through some grace of personality, to be different enough to balance rather than to clash. On an evening in the autumn of 1887, Harlan and Elsie sat on the porch of the house that had grown by 2 additional rooms from its original frame, and that was surrounded by 40 acres of working ranch land, and by the familiar enormous Kansas sky going golden in the west. James was inside with a book that he had not wanted to put down for dinner, and had been permitted on this occasion to bring to the table. Ruth was asleep in her cradle, having exhausted herself earlier in the afternoon by crawling at top speed across the kitchen floor and requiring extensive supervision. Elsie had a cup of tea going cold in her hand because she had forgotten to drink it and was watching a hawk work the upper air above the far fence line. "I want to tell you something else," she said, because this was a thing she did now, offered the things she was thinking to him, having discovered that it was safe to do so, and that the safety made the thoughts themselves more interesting. "All right," he said, the same as he always said. "When I was behind the church that Sunday," she said, "with the letter, I thought it was over. I thought that was the end of the particular life I had built and that I was going to have to start over, and I was prepared to do it. I had the specific determination you develop when you have already done an impossible thing once and know, in the abstract, that you can do it again." She paused. But the thing I was not prepared for, she said, was that the thing I most did not want to lose was not the town or the school or the name or any of the external things. It was you. Which was extraordinary because I had spent the entire previous 6 months convincing myself that there was nothing between us worth naming. He was looking at her. There was the lantern light from the front window falling across him, and the last of the evening sky behind him, and his face had the quality it had in the moments she valued most, the quality of someone who is completely present and completely honest. "I know," he said. "You knew then," she said. "I suspected," he said. "I had noticed something." She laughed at that. She laughed properly, fully, in a way that she had initially not known herself capable of and that she now considered one of the straightforward good things about being alive. "You had noticed everything," she said, which was an old echo between them, a call and response that they had never explicitly agreed on but that had become, over the years, one of the small private languages of a long marriage. "Everything," he confirmed, and took her forgotten tea gently from her hand and refilled it from the pot on the small table beside his chair, and handed it back, warm. She took it and sat with him in the large and generous quiet of the autumn evening, with the hawk still working the far air and the first stars beginning to show in the east and the sound of James turning pages inside and the small sleeping sounds of Ruth through the open window, and she felt, with a completeness she had not previously thought was possible, the full weight and warmth of a life that was genuinely hers. Not a survival, not a construction, not a careful arrangement of surfaces and safe distances. A life. Her life, their life. Built from the specific combination of her courage and his steadiness, and the particular grace of having been seen by someone worth being seen by, and having had the nerve, finally, to step fully into the light of it. The years continue to accumulate in the good way that years do when what they are accumulating into is something real. Harlan expanded the ranch modestly and deliberately, adding cattle and eventually a small herd of horses that he and Eli managed with the same careful, competent attention they brought to everything. Elsie taught at the Caldwell Creek School until 1890, when the school board approved funding for a second teacher, and she trained the young woman who took the position with a thoroughness that reflected everything she had learned about the profession she had turned to out of necessity and come genuinely to love. She did not stop teaching entirely. She moved the instruction into the community, offering evening classes for adults who had not had the educational access their children now did, reading and arithmetic and the basic legal literacy that she had come to understand was one of the most significant practical deficits in frontier life for people who had no formal schooling. Dr. Cross became a genuine friend to them both, the kind of friendship that develops between adults who respect each other's competence and have seen each other in moments of extremity and come through them. He married a woman named Ada in 1886 who had arrived from Pennsylvania to teach at the church school, and the four of them spent many evenings together, the kind of evenings that are not remarkable in themselves, but that constitute the connective tissue of a life well shared. Eli worked the ranch through 1891, and then, having saved enough to pursue his own ambition, bought a small property in eastern Kansas and set himself up as an independent stock farmer. Harlan helped him with the paperwork and the practical aspects of the purchase, with the same complete unself-consciousness with which he did most things that were the right thing to do. Eli came back to help during the busy seasons for several years after, and the friendship between the two families persisted long beyond the working relationship. In 1893, James was 9 years old and reading at a level that alarmed his teachers in the most gratifying way, and Ruth was 6 and had developed a passion for the horses that occupied the southern field, spending every free hour in the paddock with a specific gray mare named Clover who seemed to share this preference reciprocally. The house was full of the specific comfortable noise of children and routine and work, and Elsie found, on the ordinary mornings when she was making coffee and Harlan was coming in from the early chores and James was fighting with his boots, and Ruth was singing something to herself at the kitchen window, that this ordinary noise was the most extraordinary thing she had ever been given. She was 37 years old in 1893, and she looked at herself in the glass on the mornings when she happened to catch her own eye in it, and she saw someone she recognized. Not the careful, contracted woman she had been for those 3 years of perfect preservation, and not the frightened girl in Louisville either, but someone who had come through both of those things and arrived on the other side of them as herself. She felt, and this was the word she consistently chose when she tried to articulate it, which she did occasionally in letters to Clara Marsh in Louisville, who had her own life now and her own particular hard-won peace present, not behind glass, not managing the distance between herself and the world, simply present, in the morning and the afternoon and the evening, in the full sensory reality of a Kansas autumn with the smell of hay and wood smoke and coffee, and the specific sound of her husband's boots on the porch boards. The letter from Clara Marsh in October of 1893 brought news that Elsie had known might come eventually and had decided, long ago, how she would receive. Harlan Talmadge had died that summer of a sudden illness in Charleston, where he had been living for some years. He had remarried, apparently not legally, and his second wife had not been spared the particular fate that Elsie had known firsthand. Clara wrote about it with the contained grief of someone who has witnessed a wrong they could not prevent and is not sure what to do with the feeling that remains. Elsie wrote back and said that she was sorry for the woman who had suffered it, and that she hoped there was something of justice in the fact that the story had ultimately reached its end, and that she kept Clara in her thoughts always, and that she hoped Clara's own life continued to hold the good things it had been building toward. And then she folded the letter and set it in the box where she kept correspondence that mattered, and she went back to the kitchen and put the kettle on and looked out the window at the afternoon. Harlan came in from the south field while the water was heating and saw her face and came to where she was standing and put his hands on her shoulders from behind and said, "What is it?" she told him. He stood behind her with his hands steady on her shoulders, and she felt the warmth of him and the solidity of him, and she took a breath that went all the way down. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and meant it completely. "It does not change anything that is here. I just needed a moment with it." "Take all the moments you need," he said, and kissed the top of her head and stepped back when the kettle began its noise, and she made the tea. That evening, after the children were asleep, they sat in the front room with the lamp turned low, and she told him what she had been thinking, which was not about Calhoun or the past, but about the future, specifically about James and whether he would want to go east for his schooling when the time came, because she was increasingly certain he had the capacity for it, and about Ruth and the horses and whether there was a genuine skill there worth developing formally, and about whether the evening adult classes she had been running might become something more formally organized with perhaps the backing of the Methodist Church, which had been increasingly interested in community education. He listened to all of this with his specific quality of engaged attention and offered thoughts on each thing with the same quality, and then he said, slightly out of the context of any of it, that he wanted her to know he was glad every day. She looked at him. "For what specifically?" "For all of it," he said. "But if you need specifics, for the fact that you said yes behind the church that August morning, despite every reason you had not to. For the fact that you were the person you are, stubborn and brave and funnier than anyone gives you credit for, and that I happened to be paying attention at the right time." She felt the words settle in her the way good things settled, not with a burst of feeling but with a deep, even warmth that was more substantial than excitement. "I am glad too," she said, "for every specific thing." They sat together in the lowered lamplight of their own front room, in the house that was their house on the land that was their land in the life that was their life, and the night moved over the Kansas plain outside the window with its enormous stars and its vast, indifferent, beautiful emptiness that had turned out, against every expectation, to be the place where she found everything. James grew up and went east for university as she had predicted, and came back to Kansas after, because the east was interesting and the west was his, and he ran a portion of the ranch alongside a law practice in Wichita that would have made Sheehan proud. Ruth developed the horses into a genuine operation and was known across 3 counties for the quality of her stock. She was 20 years old in 1907, and magnificent in the way that certain people are magnificent who know exactly what they are for and have been given room to become it. Elsie and Harlan were older now, the particular older that accumulates in the body from genuine living and genuine work, and they moved more slowly in the mornings and needed more light for reading in the evenings, and neither of these things was a source of complaint. On a spring evening in 1908, the two of them sat on the same porch where they had sat so many times, looking at the same expanse of Kansas sky, and Elsie had her hand in his and was not thinking about anything particular, which was a luxury she had spent a long time earning. "You are doing it again," he said. "What?" "The thing you do when you are entirely content," he said. "You go very still, but it is different from the other kind of still. The other kind was about making yourself small. This is the opposite." She considered this. "I did not know there was a visible difference." "There is," he said. "I noticed it the first time a few years in, when you were watching the children in the south field and you did not know I could see you." She shook her head. "You have been watching me for 27 years. "I have," he agreed, entirely without apology. She looked at him in the spring evening light. This man she had married out of necessity, and stayed married to out of choice, and loved out of the deep and unconditional conviction that comes from being known fully and loved fully in both directions. She thought about the August morning behind the church when everything had been terrifying and falling, and about the words she had whispered, about how she had not had anyone notice that about her before, the hidden true shape of her life, and about what he had said back, and about how those words had turned out to be the beginning of everything that came after. "I have not ever regretted a single day," she said. He squeezed her hand. "Neither have I." The prairie wind moved over the Kansas plain, warm and smelling of grass and new growth, and all the ordinary eternal things that were there long before any of them arrived and would be there long after. And they sat together on their porch in the evening of a life very well lived, and were glad.